The late afternoon sun slanted across the bustling city street, painting everything in rich gold and long slanting shadows that stretched toward the pavement like fingers trying to connect. The light gave the passing cars a gentle sheen, and even the cracked sidewalks and faded store signs gained a kind of quiet dignity under its glow. It was a time of day when everyone seemed both a bit weary and subtly renewed, as if the dusk held the promise of slowing down after a frantic day. Amid this atmosphere stood Lamine, his shoulders slightly hunched, his gaze darting cautiously from one face to the next. He moved with measured steps, as if considering each stride before committing to it, his bright yellow hoodie catching the light so vividly that some passers-by squinted at the sudden burst of color. The hoodie was a beacon, a defiant statement of presence in a world that often overlooked people like him. Lamine, 14 years old, black, and living with Down syndrome, did not stride through the streets with confidence. He was not that sort of boy. Instead, he carried himself with the quiet determination that sprang from deep inside. There was an anxious flutter in his chest, a sensation he knew too well, like dozens of tiny birds flapping their wings just behind his ribs. This sensation often visited him when he ventured into unfamiliar spaces or found himself surrounded by strangers whose judgments he could almost feel pressing against his skin. Yet, he moved forward despite it, navigating the shifting tide of humanity that surged along the sidewalk. He clutched a worn leather notebook under his arm, the edges softened by countless hours of his careful handling. Inside it lay a treasure unlike any other he had ever possessed: his drawings. These were not simple scribbles or aimless doodles. No, they were elaborate sketches that captured whole worlds, each page telling a story crafted from the wild, colorful depths of his imagination. In these pages he had drawn things he could never say out loud with the ease others seemed to manage: fantastical landscapes, heroes who looked a bit like him, gentle creatures that represented kindness, and sometimes portraits of people he admired or loved. He had worked on them meticulously, kneeling on his bedroom floor late at night, making gentle pencil strokes that whispered his truths onto the paper. His drawings were his voice, steady and unwavering in a way that his spoken words sometimes were not. This evening, he had chosen a corner at the intersection of Wellington and Fifth. He had picked it carefully, recalling something his mother once said about places where people from all walks of life crossed paths. Lamine hoped that in this swirl of humanity, someone, anyone, might pause to see him. He hoped they might glance down at his drawings and feel a spark of understanding, or at least curiosity. He knew that standing here and opening his notebook for strangers was a risk. There were those who would laugh, snicker, or turn away in confusion. But there could also be others who might smile, nod, and recognized the care he poured into his work. And if just one person saw his drawings and found them meaningful, then the knot of fear in his chest would be worth it. The street was crowded at this hour. People hurried by in suits that seemed too stiff, holding phone conversations and chiding themselves over missed appointments. Parents tugged at the hands of restless children, promising dinner soon. Teenagers huddled in clusters, laughing at inside jokes, their voices bouncing off the glass storefronts. Some paused when they caught sight of the boy with the bright yellow hoodie, curious but uncertain. A handful of onlookers began to form a loose ring around him, their initial motivation unclear, perhaps drawn by the vivid color of his hoodie, or the way he stood still while everyone else rushed, or by the intensity on his face as he prepared to open his notebook. Lamine's heart beat faster. The city's hum seemed to fade slightly as he became hyper-aware of the eyes on him. He could feel his cheeks warming. He took a deep breath. Beneath the mild scent of exhaust fumes and the sweetness drifting from a bakery half a block away, he detected a perfume worn by a woman who'd stopped to watch. It smelled like flowers after rain. Another deep breath. He ran the pad of his thumb over the notebook's worn spine, a familiar gesture that steadied him. The leather felt cool, reassuring him that he was not adrift. He had his art, his truth, right here. He took one careful step forward, closer to the center of that widening circle of strangers. A faint scrape of his sneaker against the sidewalk and a subtle shift in the crowd. Now he was truly on display. His pulse thundered in his ears. He imagined telling them what his drawings were about, but he struggled to find the words that would wrap around his feelings neatly. The drawings would have to speak for themselves. A few feet away, an older gentleman in a gray hat watched with narrowed eyes. Lamine couldn't tell if the man was skeptical or merely curious. Beside him stood a young woman, clutching a shopping bag to her chest, her eyebrows slightly raised, her posture guarded. Lamine could sense their uncertainty. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the notebook under his arm. Just then, someone stepped out of a nearby shop doorway, adjusting their coat and joining the circle. A young mother paused with her daughter, letting the girl peek around her skirts to see what this quiet boy might do. Lamine drew another breath, summoning courage from deep within. He thought of his mother's words, that the world was large and sometimes frightening, but that people could surprise you with kindness when you least expected it. He remembered how she said that true bravery was when you took a step forward, even while shaking. Lamine squared his shoulders. The late light gilded his hoodie, and for a moment he felt like a figure in one of his own drawings, standing at the edge of something remarkable. He would share his art today, open the notebook, lift up one of his favorite sketches, and hold it out for them to see. He would risk their judgment, their misunderstanding, and their indifference, because in doing so, he might also open the door to recognition, understanding, and maybe even respect. Something important was about to happen, though no one yet knew just how important. The afternoon's final rays of sunlight gave way to a gentle dimness, and a hush of anticipation fell over that corner of the city as Lamine prepared to turn the first page and show them who he truly was. Lamine lifted the corner of the page gently, as if it were made of delicate leaves that could crumble at the slightest misstep. His heart drummed against his ribs. He knew that within those pages lived pieces of himself so personal that sharing them felt almost like stepping onto a stage without knowing his lines. Still, he pushed through the doubt, inhaling slowly until the warm city air mixed with the lingering scent of his pencil marks. He counted in his head, 1, 2, 3, before spreading the notebook wide enough for the onlookers to see. The chosen page depicted a nighttime garden bathed in silver moonlight. Lamine had drawn tiny lanterns hanging from tree branches and placed flowers with swirling petals around a small pond. In the corner, a subtle figure watched from behind leaves, a superhero he'd sketched, who bore a faint resemblance to himself. This hero wasn't donning a flashy cape. Instead, he wore a calm expression and a simple outfit that mirrored Lamine's own casual clothes. It was a world Lamine had created where things were gentle, safe, and full of quiet magic. A cluster of curious eyes leaned closer. He saw a man in a striped tie furrow his brow, trying to understand the scene. A woman with a shopping bag pressed tighter against the crowd, her face softening as she took in the details. Yet among them lurked a few skeptics. He could feel their skepticism like a chill on the back of his neck. A teenage boy whispered something to her friend, muffling a short snicker. Lamine's pulse kicked up a notch. He could easily close the notebook, slip away, and pretend this never happened. He could lose himself in the throng of pedestrians and never risk exposure again. But he didn't move. He kept the image lifted high, refusing to hide what he'd poured his heart into. As the hush settled, the sounds of the city seemed to grow distant. The constant hum of traffic, the low chatter of pedestrians, the ring of a bicycle bell somewhere down the block, all of it melted into a background murmur. Here, in this small circle, Lamine felt suspended in a moment that could tilt either toward acceptance or rejection. He tightened his grip on the notebook. The corners of the pages curled slightly under the gentle breeze. His palms were damp, and he feared leaving sweaty fingerprints on his cherished drawings. Still, he did not lower the book. A child's voice piped up from somewhere near the back of the gathering. "Look at the lights in the trees, Mom." The child sounded delighted, as if discovering a secret hidden in the branches. Lamine's heart gave a small leap. Someone had noticed the lanterns, those tiny details he had labored over, pressing his pencil so carefully to create their soft glow. That child's enthusiasm was a spark he clutched at, something that might fan into a flame of understanding if the crowd gave it time. He dared to slide his gaze across the faces before him. He saw uncertainty, yes, but also hints of curiosity. The man in the striped tie tilted his head, as though re-examining the image with fresh eyes. The teenage boy who had snickered grew quieter, leaning in just a bit to see what his friend pointed at. Maybe a tiny animal Lamine had drawn peeking from behind the cluster of bushes, and the woman with the shopping bag now looked more tender, as if acknowledging the courage it took for someone like Lamine to stand here, notebook raised, under the judgmental gaze of strangers. Lamine swallowed, the dryness in his throat easing just enough for him to consider speaking. Words hovered on the tip of his tongue. He wanted to say, "I drew this because the world can be so loud, and I love places that feel gentle and still." He wanted to explain how each lantern represented a moment of kindness he'd witnessed, like when a neighbor helped carry groceries up a flight of stairs for an elderly resident, or when a teacher offered encouraging words after a tough morning. He wanted to tell them about the superhero he'd imagined, who looked like him and could make gardens bloom with a quiet gesture of his hand, bringing comfort and peace instead of showy battles and explosions. But these words stuck somewhere deep inside him, tangled in the anxiety that pressed at his lungs. So he let his drawings speak for him. He watched the shifting expressions of the crowd, some still puzzled, others softening. The hush was not absolute silence. There was an electric feeling in it, as though everyone waited for something more. And maybe they were waiting for him to turn another page, to reveal another world, another clue that might help them understand who he was and why he stood there offering these sketches like gifts. He slowly began to lower the notebook, not in defeat, but to reposition it so that those closer to him could see the details better. The lanterns, the superhero, the flowers with their intricate petals. He wanted their eyes to linger, to take in the story he'd drawn. A couple of people leaned forward, as if compelled to inch closer. In that tiny movement, Lamine sensed a shift. Not all skepticism melted away instantly, but at least some of it seemed to waver. His chest no longer felt quite so tight. The fear was still there, but it was tempered by a blossoming hope. He reminded himself he belonged here as much as anyone else on this street. If they could stand on corners waiting for taxis or chatting about their days, why couldn't he stand here and show them something beautiful he'd created? Moments stretched. He felt a bead of sweat slide down the back of his neck. One or two people drifted off, uninterested, but others stayed. He imagined their thoughts. Maybe they were silently comparing his drawing to real-life places they'd visited. Maybe they were remembering childhood fantasies. Maybe they were intrigued that the superhero looked a little like the boy holding the notebook, wondering what that meant. Lamine held the drawing steady, refusing to let it waver, even as the breeze teased the pages. He stood rooted, a bright yellow splash of color in that concrete corner, surrounded by uncertain strangers. He knew he hadn't won their admiration yet, but he'd earned their attention. That was enough for now. He had dared to reveal a part of himself, to risk their judgments, for a chance to be seen. Having them noticed proved him stronger than he had felt in a long time. He braced himself to turn another page soon, to offer another glimpse into the worlds he carried inside. For now, he let this moment breathe, allowed them to look and wonder, and hoped that someone, just one person, would see the love and longing in every pencil stroke. Lamine's chest tightened at the man's outburst, as if a hand had closed around his ribcage and begun to squeeze. Just seconds before, he had stood before a curious, if uncertain crowd. Now it felt as though the atmosphere had curdled, and suspicion hung in the air like smog. He lifted his eyes warily, trying to pinpoint the source of the voice. There, on the left side of the loose circle, stood a middle-aged man with a pinched face and a posture as stiff as a fence post. The man folded his arms and jutted his chin forward, as if daring Lamine to respond. "What's this kid doing here?" the man repeated, louder this time, rattling the hush that had settled. His tone held an edge of offense, as though Lamine's quiet presence, his yellow hoodie, or the delicate drawings he clutched were somehow an affront. Behind the man, a pair of teenagers giggled, one covering her mouth to stifle the sound while the other rolled her eyes. A few others looked away, feigning disinterest, or shuffled their feet nervously, unsure whether to step back or remain in place. Lamine's heart beat faster, each thump a reminder of how much he wanted to fade into the background and avoid this moment altogether. He could feel the tension radiating through his body. His hands shook slightly as he pressed the notebook against his chest, feeling the worn leather cover warm beneath his fingertips. He tried to focus on the subtle texture of it, on the weight of its pages, anything to anchor himself. The man's words repeated in his mind, rattling around and mixing with the faint murmurs of the crowd. Lamine's cheeks grew hot. He wasn't just nervous. Now a mix of shame and anger churned within him, emotions so potent he could taste them at the back of his throat. He considered turning away, just walking off, letting the city swallow him up. If he took a few steps back, he could lose himself in the throng. He might imagine that none of this had happened, that he had never attempted to share something so personal and precious in front of strangers. But then he thought of his mother's words. She had told him that his drawings were more than just pictures. They were his voice, his story. They represented all the things he dared to believe in, all the places he visited in his dreams, and all the quiet strength he carried inside. "Your art is your voice. Let it speak," she had said, leaning in close, looking him right in the eye. She believed in him, even when the world seemed harsh and disinterested. She saw something shining in his work. Lamine swallowed hard and forced himself to remain still. He would not allow a stranger's contempt to dictate his worth. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, lifting the cover of the notebook. He flipped past the garden scene, the one with lanterns and hidden heroes, turning until he found another image that might hold meaning for those willing to see it. It was an ocean scene, one he had drawn late at night when he couldn't sleep. In it, soft waves rippled under a crescent moon, their edges highlighted by silver pencil strokes that caught and cradled the moonlight. He had placed a small sailboat in the distance and drawn tiny stars overhead, each one painstakingly rendered to convey hope against a vast, mysterious darkness. With careful fingers, he raised the notebook, revealing this seascape to the onlookers. He fought the trembling in his arms and tried to steady his breathing. He wanted them to see beyond the simple lines and shading, to feel something of the calm and quiet determination he'd tried to capture on the page. Maybe, just maybe, they would understand that he was more than a distraction or a spectacle. The man who had spoken watched with narrowed eyes, but Lamina did not look at him directly. Instead, he scanned the rest of the crowd. Some curious, some uncertain, a few openly skeptical. The tension thickened, as if everyone were holding their breath, waiting for a reason to laugh or walk away, or, in some small part of Lamina's desperate hope, to offer a word of kindness. He lifted his chin slightly, refusing to cower. He would not bow his head this time. The man's scorn stung, but Lamine had his voice here in these pages, and he would let it speak for itself. The ocean scene was quieter than the garden, less populated by characters, simpler in composition, but that was intentional. He remembered the night he drew it, sitting cross-legged on his bedroom floor, with a single lamp burning. His pencil had glided over the paper, creating gentle curves for the waves, soft shading for the sky, and subtle highlights for the moon. He wanted it to feel like a lullaby without words, a visual whisper of comfort. Now, under the streetlights and the watchful gaze of strangers, he hoped they might hear that silent lullaby echoing in the image. Perhaps it could soothe the jagged edges of the tension that had flared up at the man's words. It wasn't so much the words as the way Nate had pictured them. A few people leaned in. The teenager who had rolled her eyes glanced again, this time less mockingly. A mother with a small child pressed forward slightly, as if drawn by the serene glow of the moon in Lamine's sketch. Someone cleared their throat, and a car honked distantly, but still no one spoke. Lamine stood there, breathing evenly now, anchored by the memory of his mother's voice, and the strength he discovered each time he poured himself into his art. He refused to let fear or insecurity break his resolve. In that silence, heavy but charged, he wondered if the man would speak again, or if someone else would step up, challenge him, defend Lamin, or mock him further. He couldn't know. All he could do was stand firm and let his pencil lines and carefully shaded horizons speak for him. He wanted them to see that although he struggled to find the right words, he had poured his truth onto the page. He wanted them to realize that the drawings were not just childish scrawls, but extensions of his heart, beating quietly in graphite and ink. As he held the notebook steady, he noticed subtle changes in a few faces. Some frowned thoughtfully, trying to read him or the artwork. Others softened ever so slightly, as if the gentle moonlit waves had stirred something reflective in them. And yes, some still looked unimpressed, distant or unsettled by his presence. But Lamine understood that art could not please everyone. It did not need to. It only needed to connect with one soul at a time. He stood, quietly brave, refusing to let the tension crush him, and waited to see if any spark of understanding would flicker in the eyes of those before him. The couple's arrival was graceful, as if they had drifted in from another world, a calmer, kinder one where people paused long enough to notice something special. They stood just beyond the others, hand in hand, taking a moment to absorb the scene. Lamine watched them carefully, his breath held in his chest. They seemed so different from the skeptical man who had barked at him moments ago, or the snickering teenagers who treated his art like a sideshow. The woman's long coat fluttered slightly as a late afternoon breeze stirred through the crowded sidewalk. Her eyes gleamed behind her glasses, reflecting the soft glow of the streetlights that were beginning to flicker on in the encroaching dusk. She leaned close to her partner, and he responded with a silent nod, as if they were sharing a quiet understanding. Then, without fanfare or hesitation, they stepped forward, closing the gap between themselves and Lamine. Their movement was gentle but purposeful, parting the throng of curious onlookers who now looked to them, perhaps hoping they would deliver some verdict. Lamine felt a tremor of uncertainty. Would they mock him too? Would they tell him to move along, that he was blocking the sidewalk, that no one wanted to see his scribbles? Instead, the woman released her companion's hand and crouched down, placing herself at Lamin's eye level. In that gesture, Lamin sensed a profound respect. She was meeting him where he stood, not towering above him. Her posture was calm, relaxed, as if she had all the time in the world to look at this boy's artwork. When her gaze fell upon the drawing he currently displayed, a cityscape garden at dusk, shimmering lanterns suspended in trees, and a tiny figure of a hero among the leaves, her eyes lit up. She didn't just glance, she studied it with care, tracing the lines with her pupils as if memorizing every stroke. "This is beautiful," she said, her voice low and warm. The words seemed to ripple outward, quieting some of the murmurs. Lamine's heart gave a surprised flutter. He'd hoped someone might understand, but hearing that kind affirmation was like a soft, steady hand resting on his shoulder. He saw no mockery in her face, no pity either, just genuine admiration. She appreciated what he had created on the page, without qualification or doubt. Behind her, the man stepped in closer. He had a thoughtful demeanor that matched his salt and pepper hair, and as he took in the drawing, he nodded, as if confirming what his partner had said. "Your art has such feeling," he added, and these words settled into Lamine's mind like a soothing balm. Feeling, yes, that was it. He had poured his emotions into these sketches, his hopes, his fears, his quiet dreams. To have a stranger see that feeling and name it so simply felt like a gentle unlocking of a door he'd never known how to open. The crowd shifted. There was still uncertainty lingering in the air, but the hostility that had flared up before seemed to wane. People who had smirked or rolled their eyes now looked back at the couple, as if trying to understand what they found so special. The onlookers didn't vanish, nor did they all transform into admirers, but the tension eased, loosening its grip on Lamine's chest. Instead of a sea of judging faces, he saw a handful of curious expressions, a few softened glances. Lamine blinked at the couple, his cheeks warming beneath their kind regard. He wasn't used to being acknowledged in such a direct and honest way by strangers. Usually, people passed him by without a word, or they offered a polite nod before moving on. He had grown accustomed to blending into the background, his art tucked safely in his notebook. But now, with just a few kind words, this couple had changed the rhythm of the moment. He felt a surge of confidence that he had not known he possessed. He opened his mouth, intending to thank them, but the words tangled in his throat. He managed a small, shy smile, nodding in appreciation. His fingers relaxed their tight grip on the notebook's spine. The woman returned his smile, encouraging him with her eyes. She didn't pressure him to speak. Her understanding was wordless and patient. The crowd's tone shifted further. Someone whispered, "I guess it's kind of nice," and another person cleared their throat, as though rethinking their initial reaction. The couple's affirmation had cracked something open, allowing a more generous interpretation of Lamine's presence. He was no longer just a strange boy on a sidewalk holding odd drawings. Now he was an artist, nervous, yes, but genuine, offering something meaningful to those who cared to look. For a brief moment, the street noise faded. The honking cars, the rumble of a distant bus, the chatter of nearby conversations, all of it receded into a gentle hum. In this quieter space, Lamine felt truly seen, as if a spotlight had emerged from nowhere, illuminating not just his sketches, but the heart that guided his pencil. The couple stood by him, not rushing, not checking their watches. Something to learn from a sister, consult. They seemed perfectly content to spend their time witnessing his work, which made him feel worthy of that time. Drawing a slow breath, Lamine dared to show them another page. He turned carefully, revealing a new scene, this time an evening ocean, calm waves under a crescent moon. He held it out a bit closer, offering them a better view. A hint of color rose in his cheeks, but it was no longer from anxiety. It was from the quiet joy of being accepted, if only for this moment. The woman tilted her head, her expression softening even more. "I love how peaceful this is," she said gently. The man agreed, murmuring, "It's like we can hear the waves." Lamine's smile widened, and he glanced around at the onlookers. A child tugged at a parent's sleeve, pointing at the drawing. The parent nodded thoughtfully, and a murmured kindness passed through a small knot of observers. In that instant, Lamine understood that the couple's words had done more than just compliment his art. They had granted him permission to exist in this space without shame. Their kindness had the power to shift the narrative. A moment ago, he had been on the defensive, worried that his efforts would never be understood. Now, he could breathe, share, and believe in the worth of what he had to offer. As the woman stood up slowly, still smiling, and the man placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, Lamine held their gaze for a few beats longer. He wanted to thank them, but he sensed they knew already. Their presence, their words, and their unwavering attention had said enough. The brightness in his eyes and the steadiness in his posture, once he stood up straighter, were all the response they needed. In that moment, under the warm glow of streetlights and the hush of a once conscientious crowd, Lamine felt truly seen for who he was and what he could create. Encouraged by their kindness, Lamine carefully turned another page. He pressed a fingertip gently against the corner to keep the paper from flapping in the slight evening breeze. The scene he revealed was different from the others he'd shown. A city skyline alive with shimmering windows, tiny silhouettes of dancers behind curtains, and a generous scattering of stars that winked as if sharing a private joke. He'd drawn lampposts glowing in quiet alleys, roofs where cats perched, and distant buildings that seemed to hum with unseen stories. He'd tried to capture the city as he imagined it at night. Not just a jumble of concrete and metal, but a tapestry of human moments, dreams, and whispered songs. Elaine placed a hand over her heart, leaning forward. In the dim glow of the streetlights, Lamine could see her eyes shining behind her glasses. He watched her lips part slightly, as though she had inhaled the drawing's energy. She seemed grateful for its warmth, for the gentle pulse he'd given to each line. Marcus edged closer. "You've got real talent. You tell stories with your pencil." The words rang in Lamine's ears, sinking deep into his chest. Talent. Stories. Until now he had mostly known his drawings as feelings and imaginings he couldn't quite articulate in words. Hearing someone else recognize that he was communicating, that he was shaping a narrative with his pencil, made him feel oddly weightless, as if the sidewalk beneath his feet had softened. He tried to respond. He wanted to explain the meaning of those tiny dancers glimpsed through apartment windows, how he had once watched a family in his neighborhood as they slow danced in their living room on a lazy Sunday evening, and how that memory had found its way into this skyline. He wanted to tell them how the stars were meant to suggest that even above the tallest buildings, hope always hovered, small but brilliant. But when he opened his mouth, the words tangled like unruly threads. His tongue felt thick, and his mind scrambled for a phrase, any phrase that could express what he felt. Nothing coherent emerged. Instead, he nodded and managed a trembling smile. It was a shy gesture, yet it carried an entire world of gratitude. He hoped they would see how much their acceptance meant. Elaine's gaze softened even more, as if reading his thoughts, and Marcus offered a gentle nod of understanding, his expression calm and encouraging. They were patient, these two, and Lamine sensed that he did not need perfect words for them to understand. They would wait as long as he needed, ready to listen whenever he could speak. They asked his name. Lamine's lips parted, and he heard himself say it, softly, almost timidly. He feared his voice might crack, but it didn't. Instead, the sound drifted into the evening air, landing gently between them. Elaine smiled and repeated his name, as if tasting its shape, giving it importance. Then she introduced herself. Elaine. It sounded like a soothing breeze. Marcus, too, with his salt and pepper hair and steady gaze. Their names were simple, kind-sounding. Lamine repeated them in his mind, imagining them printed in neat letters in his notebook, next to a sketch of two figures who cared enough to see him. They did not laugh at the way he spoke, nor did they flinch at his difference. They treated each syllable as something precious, worthy of care and attention. Lamine felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, not out of sadness, but from a quiet, overwhelming relief. He had come to this corner with trembling hands, expecting to remain invisible, or worse, ridiculed. Now he stood between these two strangers who had placed their faith in his art, who believed his drawings held meaning, who offered kindness without condition. Around them, the crowd began to shift. Some watched uncertainly, as if unsure how to behave now that a bridge had formed between the boy and the couple. Others took a step closer to the notebook, craning their necks to see what Elaine and Marcus found so moving. A few people looked away, embarrassed perhaps by their earlier dismissiveness, but many stayed, their postures softening as if drawn by the quiet courage unfolding in front of them. Lamine noticed a man in a baseball cap leaning in, his eyebrows knitting together in concentration as he studied the skyline scene. A woman with a floral scarf murmured something appreciative under her breath, a faint smile playing on her lips. Even the teenagers who had snickered earlier were now more subdued, exchanging uncertain glances. The crowd was not uniform in its response, but something was changing. An unspoken understanding passed from person to person, prompted by Elaine and Marcus's simple affirmation. The hush that settled over the corner felt charged with possibility. Car horns still honked in the distance, and the rumble of a passing bus rattled the pavement. Yet, within this loose circle of onlookers, there was a gentler current. It was as if the city's noise and chaos had receded just enough to allow them to see Lamine's drawings for what they were, the voice of a boy who had found a way to share himself in lines and curves of graphite. Elaine's voice came again, low and full of warmth. "Thank you for showing us this," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Marcus nodded in agreement. Lamine's heart thumped in his chest. He swallowed and managed a quiet thank you in return. It was not the long explanation he might have wanted to give, but it was genuine, and it carried the full weight of his gratitude. In that moment, Lamine felt a change within himself, just a spark, gentle but insistent. He began to see his own worth reflected in their eyes, in the way they had chosen to meet him with kindness instead of judgment. He understood that Elaine and Marcus had done something more powerful than merely complimenting his drawings. They had acknowledged him, with all his complexities, as someone whose voice mattered. Their kindness was contagious, an encouraging note that hummed in the evening air, inviting others to listen more closely, look more gently, and, perhaps, reconsider their first impressions. And as Lamine stood there, cheeks warm, he realized he had found a little piece of what he'd been looking for. A moment of being truly seen. He gripped his notebook, turning it slightly to show a tiny hidden detail in the skyline, the shape of a rooftop bench where he'd imagined people resting and finding peace. He offered it silently, trusting that Elaine, Marcus, and maybe even a few others in the crowd would understand the quiet story it told. But not everyone was swayed by their example. The man who had first complained, the one with his arms still folded tight across his chest, kept his stance, as if barricading himself behind his own contempt. His voice was gravelly and insistent. "This is a public space. He's blocking foot traffic." The accusation hung in the air, rippling through the crowd. Lamine's heart sank. He could almost feel the subtle current of agreement that followed, a handful of murmurs that grazed his ears like the brush of cold fingertips. He shrank inwardly, hugging his notebook as if it were armor. He glanced desperately at Elaine and Marcus, who now stood resolutely beside him. Their presence had been a lifeline when the mood first began to shift. With them here, he felt less alone. Two strangers who, unlike so many others, chose not to turn away. He saw Elaine straighten her shoulders, a spark in her eyes. Her voice was calm, but it carried a solidity that cut through the evening air. "He's not hurting anyone. He's sharing art." Marcus chimed in, his tone steady and appealing to reason. "We can all spare a moment to appreciate creativity, can't we?" His words rang out with a quiet authority, an invitation for the crowd to reconsider their stance. The sky had deepened to a soft navy hue, and the streetlights around them glowed like weak halos. Lamine noticed these details as if grasping at them to calm his racing pulse. He saw a few people exchange uncertain looks, and even the man who'd complained blinked as if momentarily caught off guard. Still, tension clung to the atmosphere. The middle-aged man scoffed, though his voice softened slightly as if he wasn't quite as sure of himself now. "This is a busy city," he said, his words less forceful but still brimming with annoyance. "We don't have time for this." He gestured vaguely at Lamine and his notebook, as if the artwork and its creator were inconveniences rather than human expressions. Lamine's stomach knotted tighter. He'd known the world could be harsh, but standing here in the middle of it, hearing himself dismissed as if he were something to be swept aside, rattled him to the core. He noticed Elaine's hand curling into a light fist at her side, and Marcus's jaw tensing. He wondered what gave them the strength to stand up to a crowd of strangers. It occurred to him that kindness itself could be courageous. It was something new to witness, and he felt tears prick at his eyes again, a confusing mixture of fear and gratitude. Lamine fought the urge to shrink into his yellow hoodie, to make himself invisible. He held his ground, his trembling legs and shaky breath notwithstanding, because Elaine and Marcus had shown him he was worth defending. Because somewhere within him, he believed that his art deserved to be seen. His gaze slipped over the shifting figures of the crowd. Some people looked ashamed, as if reconciling some painful memory that was also awfully familiar. Some would talk. Some would not be disturbed. Others stared at the pavement, perhaps hoping this confrontation would resolve itself. A young woman near the back cleared her throat and stepped back, no longer eager to stand so close to conflict. The city's noise flowed around them. A distant siren wailed. A car horn blared impatiently. A backdrop to the street formed a backdrop to this small standoff. Lamine realized that he, Elaine, Marcus, and this handful of skeptical onlookers were sharing a moment that might seem insignificant to anyone walking by. A boy showing sketches, a dispute over sidewalk space, a debate about worthiness. Yet, to Lamine it felt as important as any battle. There was a question at stake. Did people like him have a place out here in the open? Could his voice, drawn in pencil, matter? Another voice emerged from the cluster of onlookers. Hesitant and face it. A man in a baseball cap spoke with a slight shrug. Old man in a baseball cap spoke with a slight shrug. His words drifted out uncertainly, as if testing the air. Someone else, a middle-aged woman with a scarf looped around her neck, nodded faintly. "Oh, we're all just standing here too," she added quietly. It wasn't a grand defense, but it was something. An acknowledgement that Lamine wasn't alone, that his presence was no more disruptive than anyone else's. Elaine seized on these tentative approvals. "Exactly," she said, calm and unwavering. "Art and stories belong to everyone. They remind us to slow down, to notice each other." Her eyes swept the circle, challenging anyone to disagree without a reasoned argument. Marcus's voice joined hers, thoughtful and measured. "It's a moment, that's all. A few moments to see something beautiful. Let's not be so quick to dismiss what we don't understand." He offered a small, conciliatory smile, as if inviting the doubters to consider that maybe they didn't have to fight this so hard. He wasn't asking them to adore Lamine's drawings, only to allow them. Lamon's chest tightened again, but this time it wasn't fear that gripped him. It was emotion, raw and profound. He had never seen strangers stand up for him so openly. Usually, he navigated the world carefully, avoiding confrontation, keeping his head down, hoping to pass unnoticed. Here, he was at the center of attention, and, while that terrified him, it also sparked a fragile sense of hope. Perhaps there were people who would defend his right to be here, to share his creations, without demanding that he fit some narrow mold. He tried to steady his breathing, feeling his heart thud against his ribs. He wanted to thank Elaine and Marcus, to say something that would convey his gratitude. Instead, he mustered a soft, trembling smile and let his eyes do the talking. He suspected they understood. He had a sense that part of what made them stand by him was their willingness to hear what wasn't said aloud. The crowd remained in a state of uneasy suspension. The middle-aged man who had sparked this confrontation shifted his weight from one foot to another, looking less certain of himself. He glanced around, expecting more support, but the faces he turned to were either neutral or quietly sympathetic to Lamine's cause. Perhaps some remembered times when they had felt small, dismissed, or invisible. Perhaps they recognized a spark of courage in this boy, and it moved them. The man cleared his throat and lowered his gaze, muttering something too quiet to catch. He didn't apologize, but he didn't press further. Lamine's pulse slowly eased. He could breathe more freely now, seeing that hostility had not won the day. It was still tense, still fragile, but kindness had not been snuffed out. Elaine and Marcus stood close, their warmth radiating like a shield. The murmurs of agreement that had once stirred fear in him now sounded more uncertain, less a chorus and more a scattering of half-voices looking for direction. Lamine realized he wasn't alone. He had allies, unexpected though they were. Around them, the dusk had settled. Street lights glowed steadily. The scent of something savory from a distant food cart drifted by, and the air carried the faint hum of distant laughter. Life continued, but something had shifted within Lamine. He had faced disdain and not crumpled beneath it, and he had witnessed compassion flare up where he least expected it. They remained at a crossroads, a tense balance of forces. And yet, in that delicate tension, Lamine found a glimmer of strength. He held his notebook a little more securely and stood a little straighter, trusting that, for this moment at least, he did not stand alone. From across the street, a police officer, alerted by the gathering, began to approach. Lamine spotted the dark uniform weaving through the onlookers, and a hollow dread settled in his stomach. The officer moved with a deliberate stride, his eyes alert, scanning the crowd to gauge the situation. Lamine tried not to panic, but the lessons his mother had taught him flooded his mind, each reminder colliding with the fear already pumping through his veins. Keep your hands where they can be seen. Speak slowly and politely. Don't give them a reason to misunderstand. He held his notebook tightly, feeling the edges of the leather cover press into his fingertips, as if to remind him that his art was still there, still real, still worth defending. The officer drew nearer, cutting through a group of curious faces. As he got close enough, Elaine stepped forward, placing herself slightly in front of Lamine, as though to shield him. Her posture radiated calm authority. Her voice was measured and confident. "This boy is simply showing his art, officer," she said, motioning gently toward the notebook in Lamine's hands. "This boy is wonderful, and most of us are just enjoying them." Lamine was grateful for how she used the word us, how she aligned herself with him so effortlessly. He realized that Elaine's presence had become an anchor in this unsettling storm. Marcus stood beside Elaine, his expression calm but resolute. He offered the officer a respectful nod, as if to emphasize their shared humanity, their willingness to be reasonable. The circle of onlookers that had formed around Lamine and his sketches seemed to tighten. Some people took a small step back, giving the officer room, while others leaned in to see how this would play out. The tension was palpable, like a taut wire strung between two poles, humming with potential energy. The officer surveyed Lamine, his gaze drifting from the boy's tense shoulders to the trembling hands clutching the notebook. Lamine tried desperately to steady himself, to appear composed, though he knew his fear was plain to see. He wished he could tell the officer about his mother, about how she had taught him not to fear people in uniform, but also to be cautious. He wanted to explain the careful hours he spent bent over blank pages, how each sketch was a piece of himself set free, but all he managed was a shaky breath. A moment passed in silence. The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but as though he were struggling to understand why so many people had gathered here, why this boy stood with his heart almost visibly on display. Lamine swallowed hard. He needed to say something, to show he meant no harm, but what words could possibly convey that all he wanted was for someone, anyone, to see his art for what it was, an invitation, a bridge, a quiet voice emerging from a world too big and too complicated. He cleared his throat softly and forced the words out. I only want people to see my stories." Each syllable emerged haltingly, but he managed to say it aloud. He hoped his voice, though faint, would be enough. His eyes darted from the officer's stern face to Elaine and Marcus's steady presence. He could feel their encouragement, like a warm current at his back, reminding him that he was not alone. The crowd's hush weighed heavily, and it seemed as if everyone was waiting to see how this authority figure would react. Surprisingly, the officer's gaze softened, just a little. It was as if something had cracked through the facade of official skepticism, a glimpse of understanding. Maybe the officer was picturing a child at home drawing monsters and heroes, or recalling a night when he himself had paused to admire street musicians or sidewalk chalk art. Some recognition flickered there, small but significant. Whatever it was, it prompted him to incline his head, acknowledging the peacefulness of the scene. "Let's keep it peaceful," the officer said, his tone measured, not unkind. He took a small step back, relinquishing some of his authority in that simple movement. He hadn't demanded Lamine leave, hadn't insisted that art had no place here. Instead, he was making room for something he'd initially approached with suspicion. He was making room for Lamine's truth. Without waiting for further debate, the officer turned, scanning the crowd once more as if to ensure there were no threats hidden among the quiet watchers. Then he allowed himself to fade into the background, blending again with the flowing tapestry of the city street. Lamine exhaled shakily. His grip on the notebook relaxed, and he realized how tightly he had been clenching his jaw. Elaine glanced over her shoulder at him, offering a reassuring nod. Marcus let out a quiet breath of relief, his shoulders easing, as if he had been braced for an argument that never came. The onlookers stirred, some shifting uncomfortably as though they'd been caught hoping for drama. Others nodded approvingly, relieved that the confrontation had ended without cruelty. In the dimming light, the street lamps had begun to glow steadily. Cars rolled past, and a distant laugh drifted through the air. The city carried on as always, indifferent to this small pocket of tension and relief. Yet for Lamine, something fundamental had changed. He had faced the possibility of being silenced or sent away, and he had remained vulnerable, yes, but still present. He had used his own words, quiet and stumbling though they were, to stand for what he believed in. In that brief exchange, he'd learned something precious about himself. Elaine turned to him fully, voice gentle and low. "You did well," she said softly. Marcus nodded, adding, "You spoke for yourself. That takes courage." Lamine's eyes stung at their kindness, and he managed a small, grateful smile. He had expected that this could end badly, that perhaps he would have to pack up his sketches and retreat, leaving only faint footprints behind. But he was still here, still holding his art in his hands. The crowd's mood shifted subtly. The sense of menace that had once hovered in the air had dissipated. Perhaps seeing the officer step back had reminded them that no laws were broken, no crimes committed. The worst that had been done was that a quiet boy had dared to share his creations in a public space, challenging them to slow down and notice. A few people, emboldened by this moment, moved closer to look at Lamine's drawings more closely, intrigued despite themselves. Others left, shaking their heads, returning to their busy lives with a faint memory of what they had witnessed. Lamine stood quietly, absorbing the aftermath. He felt lighter, as if some weight had lifted from his shoulders. It wasn't that he believed everything would be easy from now on, but in this one delicate moment, he had found a spark of hope. He had seen that even those who arrived with suspicion could leave with understanding. He had discovered that his voice, though halting, was not lost. It was carried through pencil and paper, through quiet whispers of bravery. As he shifted his footing to show another page, his heart felt steadier. He remained there at the intersection of uncertainty and possibility, notebook at his chest, continuing to tell his stories one drawing at a time. As dusk deepened into early evening, the shifting colors of the sky seemed to mirror the changes in the crowd. The faint pinks and oranges had long since faded into a softer, muted blue, and now the city lights were making their presence known, flickering on one by one, forming constellations at eye level. Cars passed with headlights aglow, and shop windows glimmered invitingly. In the wake of the day's tensions, a calmer, more reflective atmosphere settled over that corner of the street. Some of the people who had gathered out of mere curiosity, or those who had originally approached only to whisper mocking comments to one another, found their interest waning. They slipped away, drawn back into the rushing current of urban life. But not everyone left. There were a few who lingered, leaning in to see the drawings Lamine had dared to reveal. Their expressions ranged from thoughtful to quietly admiring, and their body language spoke of a willingness to understand, something they could not have anticipated at the day's start. These were the ones intrigued not just by the images on the pages, but by the courage they had witnessed, the boy's trembling yet determined stance, the couple's unwavering support, and the unexpected dignity that had emerged from an unlikely moment of conflict. Lamine stood near Elaine and Marcus, who remained by his side, as if guarding something precious. His notebook felt lighter in his hands now, though he knew it weighed no less than before. He could sense the difference in how people saw him, and it touched him more deeply than he could put into words. The young woman with headphones around her neck stepped forward, politely asking if she could see more. "Tell us more." Lamine stood near Elaine and Marcus, who remained by his side as if guarding something precious. A young woman with headphones around her neck stepped forward, politely asking if she could see more. A man who had initially rolled his eyes earlier now scratched his chin, curious rather than dismissive. Lamine gathered his courage and turned to the last page. This piece was his most personal. He hesitated, heart beating quickly, as though on the brink of revealing a secret he had kept carefully guarded. He peeled back the page, exposing the self-portrait. He had drawn it from a photograph his mother had taken, one in which he wore a gentle smile. In the drawing, he'd let his imagination flow beyond the photo's frame, adding swirling shapes and colors that represented everything he cherished. The warmth of family, the ache of longing, the sweetness of tiny kindnesses he noticed in the world, and the resilience that was woven into his being. Elaine gasped softly, hand rising to her chest as tears welled in her eyes. In the golden glow of the streetlights, her tears caught the light, shining like tiny crystals. Marcus's touch on Lamine's shoulder was gentle but steady, communicating admiration and respect without a word. The crowd that remained murmured quietly, leaning forward as if not to miss a single detail. There was no mocking now, no harsh laughter. If anything, a hush settled over them, a reverent quiet that allowed everyone to see the drawing for what it truly was, the artist's soul laid bare. Lamine felt a kind of warmth surge within him, something he had never quite experienced before. It was as if, for the first time, he understood that his art was not only lines and colors on a page, not just a private world he disappeared into to escape his fears, but a bridge between him and others. Through it, he could speak a language that required no perfect pronunciation, no neat sentences. His drawings had spoken when his voice faltered, and here were strangers, some who had once been suspicious or dismissive, now transformed into gentle witnesses. They saw him as he was, a boy with unique features and challenges, but also with gifts and dreams that sparkled brightly on the page. A woman in a green scarf stepped closer, her voice quiet. "It's so full of life." Another individual, a teenager who had earlier been part of the snickering group, now looked thoughtful. He leaned toward his friend, whispering, "You can feel how much he cares." The friend nodded, no longer rolling her eyes. Lamine could hardly believe what he was seeing. When he had begun this day, he had been afraid that no one would understand or care, that he would be scorned or ignored. Yet with each turn of a page, he had found allies, protectors, and even a small audience that appreciated him for exactly who he was. Elaine and Marcus had sparked something powerful. By recognizing his worth, they had inspired others to look more carefully. That recognition now spread through the diminishing circle of onlookers like ripples on a calm pond. He thought about his mother's words. "Your art is your voice. Let it speak." Tonight, his art had sung softly under city lights, pushing through the cracks of prejudice and doubt. It had reached hearts he never thought he'd touch. He realized he could stand taller now, that he need not hide himself behind the safety of quiet corners and closed notebooks. He understood, in a way that words could never fully capture, that he had a rightful place here, just as anyone else on these streets did. Elaine sniffed gently, wiping a tear away and smiling at Lamine, as if to say, "See what you've done?" Marcus, still resting a hand on Lamine's shoulder, whispered, "You've got a gift, my friend." Lamine nodded, his own eyes misty now. He tried to form words of gratitude, but they caught in his throat. Instead, he let the moment fill him up until it overflowed into a trembling smile that said everything necessary. The small crowd that remained edged even closer. A few of them whispered questions. Where had he learned to draw? What inspired these colors and shapes? Lamine answered softly when he could, sometimes nodding or smiling more than speaking. He was still shy, still anxious, but the sharp edges of his fear had been blunted by kindness. He felt as though the swirling shapes in his self-portrait had somehow stepped off the page and entered the world around him, blending into the glow of the street lamps, weaving through the minds of those watching. Under the canopy of a night still young, people regarded Lamine with gentle eyes. They listened not just to him, but to what he had created, and in doing so, they gave him permission to exist as he was, an artist, a storyteller, a boy deserving of respect. He felt a seed of confidence pushing through the soil of his fears, stretching toward the light. He would remember this moment. He would remember the way Aline and Marcus encouraged him, how their kindness changed the air he breathed. He would remember that showing his drawings to the world was not a foolish gamble, but an act of self-belief that could inspire belief in others. The city hummed quietly around them, the pulse of distant laughter and murmured conversations blending with the hush at this small corner. Lamine looked back at his self-portrait, at the bright colors swirling around his smiling face, and he understood that these shapes were symbols of a truth he now knew. He belonged here, and in sharing his art, he had discovered not only that others might care, but that he could care about himself, enough to trust that his voice deserved to be heard, even if it was carried by pencil lines and color rather than confident words. Afterwards, as the crowd thinned, Lamine found himself following Elaine and Marcus along the sidewalk. The earlier tension in the street had faded, replaced now by a gentle hum of evening traffic and the soft glow of street lamps. He kept the notebook tucked securely under his arm, still awed by what had just happened. How strangers had paused to glimpse his inner world. How Elaine and Marcus had coaxed understanding from confusion. And how he had managed to share parts of himself he'd always kept hidden. They rounded a corner and entered a small cafe with warm yellow lights and a handwritten menu in the window. The smell of coffee and chocolate drifted out as they stepped inside. Elaine chose a table near the window, where they could watch the passing silhouettes of late shoppers and diners. The chairs were slightly creaky, the wooden table worn smooth by countless elbows and cups. It felt cozy, inviting. Marcus placed a gentle hand on Lamine's shoulder, guiding him to a seat as if ensuring that he felt safe and welcome here. They ordered hot cocoa for all three of them. The waiter, a friendly young man, smiled at Lamine, seemingly intrigued by the warmth radiating from their small group. Lamine stirred the cocoa with the spoon, watching the tiny whirlpool of chocolate and foam until it settled. It all felt dreamlike. Moments ago, he'd been fearful and uncertain, surrounded by strangers on a busy street, and now he was in a quiet cafe sitting across from two people who seemed genuinely interested in him. Elaine leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but filled with enthusiasm. "Have you ever considered illustrating a children's book?" she asked, cradling her mug between her hands. Her eyes gleamed with excitement as if she could already imagine his characters leaping from pages and delighting young readers. Lamine blinked, startled by the suggestion. He thought of his drawings, gardens shimmering in moonlight, heroes peeking from behind leaves, a gentle ocean beneath a silver moon. Could he shape such images into a narrative meant for children? He had never dared imagine such a thing. Marcus nodded, following Elaine's lead. "We know a few local publishers who are always on the lookout for fresh talent," he said thoughtfully. "And there are some great art schools around here that focus on nurturing young artists, especially those who haven't had the chance to share their work widely." He sipped his cocoa, letting the steam warm his face. "You'd be surprised how many doors open once someone recognizes your potential." Lamine listened, his heart fluttering with a mix of excitement and disbelief. Just hours ago, his greatest aspiration had been that someone, anyone, might pause to appreciate a single drawing. Now, these two kind strangers were suggesting futures he hadn't even known to dream of. Illustration, formal training, maybe even seeing his work bound in a book. The idea made him feel both weightless and grounded, as though he stood on the brink of something vast and unknown. He tried to speak, stumbling over his first few words. I never thought," he began, voice quiet. Elaine and Marcus waited patiently, not rushing him, allowing him to find the phrase he wanted. "I never thought anyone would be interested in how strange it was. I've always been too strange for the table to turn soft." "I never thought anyone would be interested," he managed finally. I never thought." Elaine and Marcus waited patiently, just to calm myself to tell my own stories. He shrugged, a small self-conscious movement. I never imagined sharing them like this." Elaine reached out, not touching him but resting her hand near his on the table, a gesture of solidarity. "Your art is powerful," she said kindly. "We saw how people reacted tonight. Even those who didn't understand at first came around. There's something honest and heartfelt about your work. It draws people in." Marcus nodded, adding quietly, "Some people go their whole lives without finding a way to communicate their feelings. You've done it beautifully through your drawings." His voice was calm, sincere. "There are programs that can help you hone these skills, give you resources, connect you with others who share your passion." Lamine took a sip of cocoa, letting the sweetness steady him. He tried to imagine himself walking into a classroom filled with other young artists, showing his sketchbook to mentors who would guide him, or attending a small exhibition where his drawings could hang on a wall, waiting for visitors to pause and look closely. The thought terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. They talked a while longer, discussing the possibility of workshops, of small community art fairs where he might show a few pieces. Elaine mentioned a friend who ran a local after-school art club. Marcus described the non-profit he worked with, a place focused on uplifting underrepresented youth, helping them find their voices through creativity. Lamine listened, nodding, letting their words sink in and settle, planting ideas he never dared to cultivate before. When it was time to leave, the air outside felt fresher than ever. The cafe's warmth lingered in his clothes, in his memory. On the sidewalk under a street lamp, Marcus took a small white business card from his wallet. He handed it to Lamine with a gentle smile. "This is my contact information. Our organization helps young artists, people like you, find mentorship and opportunities." He spoke as though it were the most natural thing in the world for Lamine to take this next step, as if believing in him was a given. Lamine accepted the card carefully, handling it as though it were fragile. He read the neatly printed text, noting the name of the nonprofit and a phone number. He swallowed, feeling tears gather at the corners of his eyes. This was real, concrete evidence that something extraordinary had happened tonight. He had begun the day with no expectation beyond being ignored or shooed away, and now he had an invitation, an open door leading toward a future he never knew existed. Marcus reached out and touched his shoulder. "If you're interested, we can help you develop your skills and find ways to share them. You don't have to rush. Think it over. Contact us when you feel ready." Elaine nodded in agreement, her eyes shining with encouragement. Lamine nodded, unable to form the words for a moment. His emotions surged: gratitude, hope, wonder. Finally, he managed a quiet, "Thank you." His voice wavered, tears shimmering as he blinked. He felt as though a new chapter of his life had begun, right here on this sidewalk, under the humming streetlights. He was no longer a secret artist. He was a boy who had shown his heart to the world and, against all odds, found people who valued it. They parted ways, Elaine and Marcus disappearing into the gentle swirl of the city's nighttime rhythm. Lamine stood still for a moment, business card in hand, the notebook pressed close to his side. He took a slow, deep breath and smiled to himself, amazed by the turns the evening had taken. He had discovered that his quiet drawings, once only his private comfort, could transform into invitations to foreign places for his personal smiles, and bridges connecting him to others who believed in him. He had opened a door to possibility, and, most importantly, had learned that he deserved to walk through it. In the following weeks, Lamine's afternoons took on a new rhythm. Instead of wandering the city streets, clutching his notebook in quiet uncertainty, he found himself in rooms filled with easels, brushes, and palettes of vivid paint. At these workshops, daylight filtered through large windows, illuminating chipped wooden floors and long tables speckled with dried acrylics. The air smelled of turpentine and paper, a comforting scent that hinted at discovery and reinvention. Other young artists, each with their own stories etched into the slope of their shoulders or the tilt of their heads, welcomed him with cautious warmth. Some had never shown their work outside these four walls. Others dreamed of galleries and acclaim, but all of them struggled in one way or another to find their place, their voice, their worth. Lamine listened to their whispered confessions and realized he was not alone in feeling uncertain. He watched as they bent over canvases, tongues poking out in concentration, and tried to absorb what he could. He learned from watching their mistakes and their triumphs. He noticed how one student mastered shading with charcoal by layering and smudging until shadows felt alive, and another created watercolor landscapes that looked delicate enough to drift off the page. He had never known there were so many ways to tell a story with pencil and paint. Instructors moved gently through the space, pointing out techniques, praising effort rather than perfection. When they came to Lamine, they spoke kindly, never rushing him. They asked about his process, what he hoped to convey, and listened attentively as he struggled to explain. In these rooms, he learned more than just how to hold a brush or mix colors to capture twilight skies. He learned to be patient with himself, to accept that uncertainty could be part of growth. He learned that each bold stroke on paper could be a step toward understanding himself and the world around him. Beyond the workshop walls, Elaine and Marcus continued to appear at the most encouraging moments. At one small community exhibition, an event cramped into a gallery no larger than a living room, Lamine displayed a series of sketches and a few painted pieces. The place smelled faintly of old coffee and fresh plaster, and it buzzed with low chatter. Elaine and Marcus arrived, offering warm smiles and quiet congratulations. They studied each piece thoughtfully, the way one might admire a cherished photograph, and asked questions that let Lamine reveal more of his inspirations. When Elaine handed him a neatly wrapped package, a new set of colored pencils and high-quality ink pens, Lamine's heart tightened with gratitude. Marcus, leaning in with a friendly pat on his shoulder, explained that he and Elaine believed in supporting young talent. "We are just giving you tools," he said softly. "The gift is yours, to create what you will." There were still nights when Lamine doubted himself. Sometimes he stared at a blank page, pencil hovering, unable to find the right angle or color. Other times, his nerves twisted in his stomach as he remembered the crowd that had once surrounded him on the street, some mocking, some hostile. He would wake before dawn, eyes wide in the dark, replaying those moments in his mind. How it felt to be so small, so frightened, and how he'd leisurely known what would happen. But then he remembered how that day had ended, the strangers who shifted from mockery to curiosity, the couple who knelt beside him and validated his worth. Those memories were like a lantern he carried inside, casting light into his uncertain corners. He used that lantern's glow to guide his pencil and brush, pouring the feelings of that transformative afternoon into his new work. He painted scenes where small acts of kindness defied a backdrop of indifference. He sketched moments where a single compassionate hand gesture or quiet smile tipped the balance from cruelty to empathy. He doodled heroes who wielded gentle words instead of swords, and who found power not in dominance, but in understanding. His studio space, no longer just a corner of his bedroom, was now a mental landscape where everyday wonders took shape, where resilience sprouted like wildflowers between the cracks of a harsh world. At another exhibition a few weeks later, Elaine and Marcus stood by him as he guided a visitor through his pieces. He explained a painting that featured a lone figure holding a lantern against a dark, crowded street. The figure's face resembled his own, and the crowd in the background was sketched only in faint outlines, ghostly silhouettes of judgment. Yet, one or two outlines reached forward, becoming more defined and human. The visitor, a teacher from a nearby school, nodded thoughtfully, tears catching in the corners of her eyes. "It's like hope shining through," she said, "like you're telling us that any one of us can change how the story ends." Lamine swallowed hard, overwhelmed that someone understood so well. He turned to Elaine and Marcus, and they smiled, as if to say, "We always knew you had this in you." And in that moment, Lamine realized that art wasn't just a private solace. It was a bridge he could use to connect with others who needed to see such truths, who craved reassurance that kindness still mattered. In the following weeks, the small changes in Lamin's demeanor were noticeable. His posture straightened slightly. He spoke with a bit more confidence, even when words were difficult. He accepted invitations to other community events, introduced himself to artists of different ages and styles, and learned from their experiences. He experimented with color more boldly than ever before, mixing hues until his canvases sang with life. He ventured beyond pencil to charcoal, watercolor, and ink, daring himself to try new mediums. All the while he remembered that day on the street, the weight of fear pressing on his chest, the stares that felt like knives, and the sudden, gentle intervention that turned everything around. He understood now that cruelty could be loud, but kindness had its own quiet strength. And if he could capture that strength in lines and shadows, in washes of color and bold shapes, then maybe others would remember it too. Perhaps someone who felt alone or misunderstood would look at his art and feel seen, just as he had been seen that day. As time passed, his drawings grew richer with layers of meaning. In them he wove the resilience he had learned to claim for himself, the kindness that Elaine and Marcus had shown, and the justice that flickered into being whenever compassion challenged cruelty. And with every piece he completed, he honored that pivotal moment when a few good people tipped the balance, allowing him to share his voice without apology or fear. A year later, Lamine stood before an audience again. This time, he was in a small gallery tucked away on a quiet side street. The building's brick facade bore a hand-painted sign, its letters curled and ornate, proclaiming the space to be dedicated to emerging voices in art. Inside, warm lamplight glowed against white walls and polished wooden floors, illuminating works of various shapes and sizes. The air smelled faintly of varnish and flowers. There were bouquets placed strategically around the room, their subtle scent mingling with that indescribable hush that often comes before something meaningful is revealed. Lamin's heart fluttered, but not with the same anxiety he once carried. Instead, excitement, pride, and a quiet gratitude danced in his chest. He remembered all too well how he had once struggled to find the courage to show his drawings to strangers. He remembered standing on a busy street corner, his hands shaking, worried that the world would never understand what he'd placed on the pages of his old leather notebook. Now, here he was, wearing a more fitted yellow hoodie, the fabric new and bright, each thread a symbol of how much he had changed. And tonight, he would present a collection of works that represented not only his inner landscape, but the journey he had taken to get here. If concentrated on these contrasts, they could teach him not only his inner landscape, but the journey he had taken to get here. Standing in the front row, Elaine and Marcus beamed at him. Lamin caught their eyes for a moment and nodded slightly, acknowledging their presence. They had become more than just kind strangers. Over the course of the past year, they had grown into cherished mentors, friends who believed in him when he scarcely believed in himself. They had visited him at workshops, introduced him to other artists, and helped him navigate opportunities that once felt too distant to grasp. Now, as he stood before this modest gathering of supporters, he owed a large part of his confidence to their unwavering faith. The crowd that had assembled for the gallery's opening night was modest, but full of genuine interest. Art students, local enthusiasts, and a handful of curious neighbors who loved discovering new talent all crowded near the center of the room, waiting patiently. He saw a teenager who resembled the kids who had once sneered at him on the street, except this young person's eyes held curiosity rather than scorn. An elderly couple stood arm in arm near a corner, quietly discussing one of Lamin's paintings. A few people whispered softly, their voices forming a gentle background hum. Lamin cleared his throat. The sound seemed loud in the hush of anticipation, but he pressed on, feeling the words form steady and sure. "I want to share my art with you," he said, his voice carrying farther than he expected. He paused, looking over the heads in the crowd, feeling their attention settle warmly upon him. "Because it tells stories about who we are and who we can be for each other." He let those words hang in the air for a heartbeat, recalling the day, a year ago, when he'd barely managed to utter a sentence to a skeptical officer. Now he spoke clearly, his voice touched by a calm strength that had grown inside him like a young tree stretching upward toward the light. He began to unveil his pieces. Each canvas, drawing, or mixed media creation had been chosen carefully. One painting depicted a city at dusk, lanterns glowing in a park where two figures stood side by side, their postures radiating understanding. Another showed a series of silhouettes linked together, their portraits forming a bridge over troubled water. There were portraits too, quiet studies of kind faces, each reflecting a moment of empathy Lamin had witnessed or experienced. Finally, there were abstract works full of swirling shapes and exuberant color, the energy of brushstrokes capturing emotions too large or subtle for words. As he unveiled each piece, murmurs of appreciation rose softly. Some people nodded thoughtfully, while others gently applauded or whispered kind words to their neighbors. One woman pressed her fingertips to her mouth, tears shining in her eyes as she viewed a small painting of a boy. Lamin's own likeness, surrounded by gentle shapes symbolizing love and understanding. The soft glow of the lamps picked out highlights in the paint and brought a soft scent of glass into the darkening room. In that moment, Lamine understood a profound truth. A single kind gesture could indeed change a life. He recalled the couple kneeling beside him on the street that day, their words cutting through the crowd's hostility. He remembered how their compassion had slowly transformed suspicion into curiosity, and then even into acceptance. That moment had allowed him to open his notebook wider, to show not just one drawing but many, until he had no reason left to hide them. He realized that compassion and understanding had saved him from a path of quiet isolation. If Elaine and Marcus hadn't stepped forward, if they hadn't offered their kind words and their later guidance, Lamine might never have found the courage to share his voice. Without that pivotal encounter, he might have remained on the margins, forever sketching in silence, believing that his art, and by extension he himself, had no place in the world. Now, he stood in this gallery that featured emerging artists, his work proudly displayed. He had found not only his voice and his purpose, but a community that valued him. The workshops, the exhibitions, the one-on-one feedback sessions, the new friends he'd made, all of it had woven together into a tapestry of support that gave him strength. Where once he had trembled with uncertainty, he now trembled with a different kind of energy, one born of excitement and hope. After the show, as people drifted in and out, offering congratulations and trading stories, Lamine stepped outside into the cool night air. The city's distant sounds wrapped around him, gently, soft laughter from a nearby cafe, the quiet hum of traffic. He felt the gentle weight of the new art supplies he carried in a small bag, gifts from Elaine and Marcus that he still cherished. He thought about the next paintings he might create, the next stories he might tell in lines and color, in shape and texture. He looked up at the stars, twinkling faintly against a deep blue sky. A subtle breeze touched his face, and in that moment he smiled quietly to himself. He was grateful for how far he had come, from a nervous boy on a street corner, uncertain if he deserved to be seen, to an artist standing in a gallery, offering his truth to the world. He understood now that art had the power to connect people, to heal wounds, to stand against cruelty with tenderness and courage. As he walked away from the gallery, his heart felt expansive, open. He carried with him the memory of a moment when strangers had chosen kindness over dismissal, understanding over fear. That memory had become the cornerstone of his growth, the anchor that steadied him when doubt tried to creep back in. He had learned that no act of empathy was too small, that a quiet encouragement could shape someone's entire future. With that knowledge, Lamine stepped into the night, ready to keep creating, keep exploring, and keep believing that art, at its best, was a gentle force that could change lives, starting with his own.